Welcome to the City. I'm Anthony Wilson, the Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And as many of you know, the top priority for our City Council and our community these last 5 years has been water, both ensuring that we have a strong infrastructure in which to treat and deliver that water, but also that we have an adequate supply. And so we've been working very diligently over the past 5 years trying to find what will be San Angelo's next water supply. And we think we've landed on a really viable option that's going to serve San Angelo for generations to come. So here to talk about that, we have two guests, and they have long titles, so I'm going to read these. We have Scott HIBBS. He is the Principal Water Resource Engineer with HET Engineering out of Abilene. And we have Jason Hill of JT Hill & Company. He is the city's Special Water Counsel. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
You bet.
So Jason, what is what we're calling the Concho River Water Project?
You know, in the shortest terms, to use to describe it, it's making new water out of the city's existing water. And what we mean by that is we're taking the city's treated wastewater effluent, and we are going to use the Concho River as a way to help enhance the water quality of that already highly treated water. And we're going to make better use of it and extend the city's existing water supplies. It's really a great solution for the city of San Angelo.
And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what that involves and how we reached this decision. So Scott, how many potential sources were studied, and what were some of those before we came to the conclusion that the Concho River Water Project is the best option for San Angelo?
Anthony, the City Council gave us the directive when we started the study to cast a wide net. So we actually looked at 24 different water supply options for the city before we narrowed it down to the recommended Concho water supply option. Those 24 included a number of groundwater options. They included a number of purchased water options, for example, from the city of Abilene, from the Colorado River Municipal Water District, from private suppliers that are out in the market. And we also took a look at effective ways to use the resource that the city has, which is its treated wastewater. And we looked at a number of non-traditional solutions like brush control, subordination, and those types of things.
And so as you were looking at all of these options, what are the factors that you were considering, both pros that sort of weighed in the advantage of some of these possibilities and cons that sort of helped to dismiss them and scratch them off the list?
First and foremost was quantity. The supply that needs to be selected for the city has to be drought resistant. It has to be available during times when you're struggling to find water from some of your other sources. So that was a key consideration. Obviously, water quality. The better the water quality we have to start with, the less expensive it is to treat and to provide to the citizens. There was a component of ownership. Most people would rather own than rent, and the same is true in the water world, so that played into the decision also.
And so what eventually led you to recommend this, what we're calling the Concho River Water Project? What were the key factors that you felt weighed in its favor?
Through this process, we narrowed those 24 down to 4 that we did a very detailed analysis on. And the Concho River water supply option was not only the most cost-effective from a unit cost standpoint, it was also the most reliable supply of the options that we evaluated. In other words, it would produce the most water for the citizens of San Angelo.
So in basic terms, as you mentioned, this project involves releasing water that's been treated at our wastewater treatment facility, highly treated water, into the Concho, and then recouping it downstream before sending it to our water treatment plant where it undergoes further treatment. What are the advantages of a process like this?
The advantages are several. One, you're using an existing supply that you already have. It's the city's wastewater, it's the city's water supply, and you're making use of an asset that you have. Secondly, we're providing it into the Concho so that we have what we call an environmental buffer, so that we're letting Mother Nature take care of some of the treatment aspects, and it becomes a more viable supply long term. Then also, when we pick up that water and bring it back into the water treatment plant, we're going to make some improvements at the plant that are not only needed for treating this source of supply, but much needed improvements to an infrastructure that is now approaching 60, 70, 80 years old that needs to start to be replaced.
And so the water that we put into the river, will we be pulling out the same amount?
You'll be pulling out the same amount. Subject to permitting and some other things, we anticipate if you put a gallon in, we ought to be able to pull a gallon out.
So Jason, how much more water is this project expected to yield for the city of San Angelo?
It's probably going to give the city, really under some pretty conservative calculations, about another 7.5 million gallons a day of use during really critical drought times. That's a significant volume of water, and as Scott mentioned or expanded upon, that's water really that the city already has. We're just being able to make better use of it, so it's really a win-win for the city.
And so from a legal standpoint, I assume that sort of clears a lot of the obstacles out of the way for you, since the city already has ownership of it. It's not something that we have to go and, as Scott said, either rent or buy.
It is, and this is really a process that that a lot of cities across the state of Texas use to help expand and make more efficient use of their water supplies. So it's an important step for San Angelo. The permitting process is pretty straightforward. And you're absolutely right. It makes a lot of difference that the city has maintained sort of control and ownership, so to speak, of this resource for so many years. But this is not a radically new concept. This is a tried and true method of extending water resources with pretty predictable permitting processes that should give the city a pretty efficient use of water.
And I want to touch on that a little bit, because a lot of people may not realize that most municipalities release their highly treated wastewater downstream, where someone else picks it up and then uses it. In fact, there are some cities along the Concho River that release their water, ends up in Ivy, and then it returns back to us in some form or fashion.
It does, and believe it or not, there's a lot of cities in the bigger watersheds, even outside the Concho watershed, Lower Basin in the Colorado, Brazos, Trinity particularly, down in the lower parts of the basin that depend on this water being released back into the watershed. It's a highly valuable resource. San Angelo is taking advantage of a highly valuable resource that for a long time it hasn't taken full advantage of.
Jason mentioned about 7.5 million gallons per day. Scott, how does that compare to San Angelo's daily water usage, or even the capabilities of the Hickory Aquifer?
Good questions. Right now, the Hickory Aquifer is capable of producing about 8 million gallons a day. As you're aware, there's an expansion project underway to bring that 8 up to 11 to 12 million gallons a day. On an average day, right now, Angelo uses approximately 12 million gallons a day. So the Concho water supply option would be about 60%, and it's right on par with how much Hickory provides.
Now, Jason, will this resolve all of San Angelo's water supply concerns now and into the future?
Anthony, I wish I could say absolutely this is it, and to show everybody go home and sleep well at night. This takes San Angelo a long ways down the road of water security, and when I mean a long ways, I'm talking generationally, 2060, 2070 timeframe. Having worked with the city staff and having worked close with the mayor and the council, I know all of those folks are sort of working tirelessly to make sure that San Angelo's water security is taken care of. So this is a great step for the city. It's a very important step for the city, but I'm going to say, based on my work with those folks at the city, that the work is never done, so to speak. So I would expect you're going to continue to see staff and leadership in the community continue to work on securing water supplies down the future.
Scott, we've talked about the Hickory Aquifer, that's groundwater. We all know about our surface supplies, and this is going to be another source of water. How important is it, especially in times of drought, to have that diversification of a water portfolio?
It's critical. I mean, I've talked to council before. That hats off to the folks back in the 70s that had the foresight to go purchase the Hickory property that has now become a lifeline for the city in terms of drought response. Having that diversity of water portfolio is something every city strives for, not every city can accomplish. So once this project is developed and online, the city will have reliable groundwater, we'll have a number of surface water supplies, and then a renewable supply, if you will, with the highly treated effluent that's put back into the Concho and then reclaimed.
Is it unusual for a city in West Texas where water is so scarce to have that diversity of water supplies?
It is. Quite frankly, we're not blessed around our part with a lot of groundwater, as evidenced by the Hickory well field being nearly 60 miles away from the city. Midland faces the same thing with their groundwater. It is 60 to 70 miles away. Up in the Abilene area, there is no available groundwater to use. So it is unique. Most cities in West Texas rely either solely on surface water supplies, or if they're in an area where they have groundwater, that's the only source that they have. So to have the diversity, to have all three components, to me is pretty critical.
So Jason, the City Council took some action regarding the Concho River Water Project on September the 18th. Explain what that was.
Well, you mentioned earlier permitting. This process is going to start with securing permits from the state, both for water treatment and for using the Concho River to move water from one point down to the next. So the council authorized the consultant team to move forward in securing those permits. Those permits don't get issued overnight, and the message, really clearly resounding message from the council is get to it.
Well, talk a little bit about that process. What's involved in securing those permits?
Well, working with state regulators in Austin, that's the sum and substance. And there are multiple regulations, particularly on the water quality side of the equation, that have to be satisfied in order for the city to get the permits that it needs for this project to go forward. And when I mean multiple, I'm talking dozens and dozens and dozens of protections for water quality. The consultant team, I'll tell you, feels extremely confident that the city is going to be able to show it will meet every one of those requirements. So in my mind, it's not a question of whether we get the permits, it's just a question of getting started on the process and getting through the process and getting those permits in hand.
And how long do you anticipate that'll take?
You know, that's the million-dollar question. But I'll tell you the general timeline I'm going to say is I think it's fair to expect about a 2 to 3 year permitting cycle. And you know, those can always be stretched out if you get folks that jump up and want to push back on the city's efforts. Sometimes that happens. But hopefully we'll be able to get all the project permits that are required in hand, you know, in less than 4 years.
And when you talk about that pushback, you're talking about political and legal challenges?
Mainly legal. Politics, I wish I could say are, you know, never come into the equation. But, you know, when I mentioned earlier that there's a pretty clearly defined process in place here, there's not a whole lot of room for deviation on getting the city off track procedurally one way or the other. So the rules of the game are pretty straightforward. Folks may try to challenge whether or not the rules of the game are satisfied, either on the merits of the application or the process that's involved. But it's a pretty predictable process. So I think the city's going to be in good shape.
So you mentioned state regulators are going to be looking at water quality and determining whether or not to issue these permits. And just so it's clear to people, what you're talking about is the quality of the water, the highly treated water that would be released into the Concho River?
Yep, that's exactly right. There's two parts to this equation. One is getting the permits secured, showing the state regulators in Austin that you will treat this water to the very high quality standards that the rules require, and then getting the authorization to essentially use the Concho. I liken it to a natural pipeline. We're using the Concho River to move water from one point down to the next. The city owns some property down on the main stem of the Concho River where we'll have some diversion facilities that'll pull that water back out and put it back toward and into the city's drinking water treatment plant. So there are two different processes, two different permits, two different sets of considerations involved there.
So Scott, this project will involve some upgrades to our water and our wastewater treatment facilities. Why will those be needed?
Two things. As Jason was just talking about, Anthony, it requires a highly treated wastewater to be able to be discharged into the Concho River. So historically, the city has not released its water. They have used it for irrigation. So that process requires just normal upgrades to the treatment plant. The second thing is, once we take it back out of the Concho downstream, we want to have current modern technology, if you will, at the water treatment plant to handle that source. And so improvements to the water treatment plant will be a critical component to this project.
So when you say modern, many people probably don't realize our water treatment plant, parts of it are upwards of 100 years old.
They are, and it's a real challenge. It's you know, kudos to staff for their ability to use aged infrastructure and still produce potable water that meets all the state criteria and requirements. But as you start dealing with the physical structures that now are approaching 80, 90, 100 years old, they just are not going to last much longer. So using this project to be able to put water treatment components in that are state-of-the-art and can serve then as a building block for the city to continue to retire some of the older technologies at the plant with newer technologies will be a key component.
So does that mean that upgrades would be necessary both to our water treatment plant, perhaps our wastewater treatment plant, regardless of the water source that was developed?
That's a great point, and that's something that the citizens need to recognize, that with any infrastructure, routine upgrades and improvements are required. The wastewater plant over the course of time has had some upgrades. It certainly is due for another one. The water treatment plant, however, has been a number of years, if not decades, since the last improvements were made. So that infrastructure is in particularly not bad shape, just aged. And so these improvements would be needed regardless of what water supply the city seeks for its future source.
So that being the case, can we begin construction of those improvements before we've actually acquired any of the permits that are going to be given to us by the state in order to release water into the Concho?
Absolutely, particularly at the water treatment plant. The key component is the filtration piece of the water treatment plant. And the city certainly could get started and would probably intend to get started on that in advance of the permits. The good news about that, Anthony, as I said, it serves as a building block for future phases to the filtration, and it also can be used with the other sources that the city currently has access to, the water that comes out of Ivy, for example, or the water that you currently pull out of the South Concho River. Both of those sources can be treated with these newer components and end up with a better quality than is currently capable of being produced at the existing plant.
Jason, you mentioned earlier about the timeline involved with securing the permits from the state. If, barring some unforeseen circumstance, from today, what's a reasonable expectation about when these new facilities and when this new project could come online?
I think it's not out of line to expect we might have a facility that's wrapped up and ready to go in 5 years or less. I know this consultant team's committed to getting this project done. I know the council is committed to seeing this project get done as expedient as we can. And like you said, obstacles can come up at any point in time, but if we have a smooth process, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect we'd be done in 5 years.
And Scott, how do you think that this project might compare to the Hickory Aquifer and development of that water source? Because as you mentioned, that's 60 miles away, so that's a lot of pipeline to have to lay just to get the water here before we can even start treating it.
It is. This project has the benefit of proximity. It's close. It has the benefit of your water, your asset that you're using. It has the benefit of new infrastructure to replace some things that are getting old. So it has a lot of those benefits, and quite frankly, being closer, 60 miles away to the Hickory provides a lot of opportunities for interruptions in that transmission and delivery system. Having this source closer, I think, will make a significant difference, and also provide some redundancy that currently you don't have in your water supplies.
Jason, do we have an anticipated cost for this project?
I think we're probably looking at about $120 million, and that includes upgrades to the facility, the necessary infrastructure that'll be involved in picking the water up down at the city's property on the Concho River, getting it back to the drinking water treatment plant. But to Scott's point that he made earlier, a lot of that $120 million is going to have to be spent one way or the other in those treatment plant upgrades. So the project of what we'll call the Concho River Water Project itself is a portion of that, but the bulk of those dollars are going to have to be spent regardless to get those facilities upgraded. That's part of the beauty of this project, quite frankly, is it's taking advantage of investments that the city's already going to have to make.
Well, and coincidentally, that matches the amount of money that was invested in the Hickory Aquifer, and that project was financed with low interest loans from the Texas Water Development Board. Would we anticipate seeking that same sort of financing through the state for this particular project?
Yeah, the city staff has been diligent and aggressive about pursuing all of the state-sourced low-interest loan programs that are available to it, and I suspect that's exactly what we're going to pursue for this project as well.
So Scott, we've heard about the upsides of this project. Are there any downsides to it?
Anthony, I really don't think so. It's a supply that is drought resistant. It has the quantity that matches. You talked about the cost of the Hickory at about $120 million for 8 million gallons a day. This is that same 120 for the 7.5, so they're comparable in size, they're comparable in scope, and it's a project that will position the city well, as Jason said, for decades to come.
You know, Jason, as you well know, at one point we did a lot of due diligence in studying direct potable reuse. This is reuse but uses completely different processes than that particular process does. Is this considered a reuse project?
You know, I'd say it's part of the same family, but it is a completely different process altogether, just like you explained it. We are taking full advantage of a resource that the city already creates at the wastewater treatment plant, but we're using not only conventional, human-made treatment means, but also Mother Nature to help get this water in the quality that it needs to be for the citizens of San Angelo to enjoy and rely on.
We've been talking with Scott HIBBS. He is a water engineer. Jason Hill, who is a water attorney. There's a lot that we're going to be reporting on this in the months and years ahead of us, because this is, as we've explained, a very important project for San Angelo and its future. So we hope you'll stay tuned and be looking for the next episode of The City.